Hello there guys, Hirosaki here. This story is all about what if Naruto was a trap master part 2. A wiser and more experienced Naruto is forced onto a team he hadn't wanted to join in the first place. However, as they say, those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Please like and subscribe to this channel before we begin, and check the description box for the author of this great storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 12, Wave, Aftermath. Kakashi groaned when yet another person came to his room in Tazuna's home asking for advice. It was the morning after a major battle, he was suffering from several injuries as well as chakra exhaustion up the wazoo, and he just wanted to sleep. Unfortunately, he had been unable to get any of that sleep he so desperately needed because the nice townsfolk of the village that surrounded Wave's main port kept coming in and bothering him. Things would have been much easier if Momochi Zabuza and that boy Haku had died on the bridge. He was still thanking his lucky stars that Haku wasn't quite the merciless killer that Zabuza had portrayed him to be. Instead of being worm food like he'd half expected to end up being when he'd fallen unconscious, he was going to be laid up for about a week before going home from yet another crappy mission. Of course, prospect of the week's inactivity really sucked because he hated being inactive. When Naruto had learned that he was still alive, and had merely been paralyzed by Haku's Senbon, he had ordered the mob of townspeople who had shown up a little too late to drive Gato and his forces out to spare the boy and the swordsman who had been lying unconscious in the middle of a damaged section of bridge. Rather than being torn apart by an angry mob as they would have otherwise been, the two were taken prisoner and dragged off to the town doctor to be fixed up before they were dealt with. The two of them received slightly more sympathy from the townspeople than they would have had when Naruto had revealed that Gato had planned on betraying them and killing them once they had completed the mission for which they'd been hired. Not much more than a little though. Now that they had them, the townspeople wanted to know what to do with the two missing nin, and had turned to him for advice since he was the highest-ranked ninja in the region. Dealing with Haku and Zabuza was a slightly sticky and problematic situation. The townspeople would not be able to keep the two locked up indefinitely as, when they finally recovered from their injuries, they would be able to easily make their escape. They weren't going to be executed either, as Naruto, who was currently the hero of the hour despite his little outburst, had pled for clemency, and the townsfolk had kindly granted it. They couldn't just let the two go on their way however, and reporting them to the Kirigakure hunter nin would just result in their executions, so they couldn't really do that either. He knew that bringing the two of them to Konoha would be a headache and a half for an entirely different set of reasons from the ones that were plaguing the people of Wave, even if they didn't escape or even try to escape while being transported. Momochi Zabuza was infamous for his attempted assassination of the Yondaime Mizuki Jigoro, and having him in Konoha would spark a diplomatic incident with Kiri which Konoha really didn't need at all. Relations were still frosty after that incident with Naruto during last year's winter chunin exam, and the reason there hadn't been any sanctions was the fact that Kiri couldn't prove that A. Naruto was a jinchuriki and B. that Naruto had been sent to Kiri with malicious intentions on Konoha's part. So, thanks to the fact that Haku and Zabuza had survived, they were stuck in a catch-22. They couldn't keep Zabuza and his accomplice, and they couldn't get rid of them either. Well, technically they could get rid of them, but Naruto would kick up one heck of a fuss which would result in another set of problems. Relations between him and Naruto were bad enough, and he didn't need to bring something like that between the two of them on top of everything else. He really wasn't in the mood for this. He was going to do what he should have done from the beginning, and say screw it before kicking this upstairs for the Hokage deal with as soon as he could summon a messenger. Let the Hokage take the fallout. He deserved it for whatever, the Hokage deserved it. Inari watched in mixed revulsion and satisfaction as the townspeople burned Gato's body. The monster that had haunted his nightmares was dead and gone, brought down by a monster that was also a hero. A good person who'd turned out to be more than he'd appeared had done something, and the evil one that had been given strength through the inaction of others who'd turned out to be weaker than everyone had thought him to be had been destroyed. Thanks to Naruto, both his mother and his grandfather were still alive. Rather than say that the enemy was too strong, Naruto had faced down an entire army, and had fought to save everyone, even though he would almost certainly have been killed. And, like in the stories, the hero had been given great strength, defeated the monster, sent the villain's forces fleeing, and saved everyone. Well, almost everyone. Some of the construction workers hadn't survived the battle that had raged around them after Gato's ninja had attacked. The thing that mattered most now though was that Wave was free, thanks to Naruto. Even though he should be back at Tazuna's resting, Naruto sat at Haku's bedside and studied the other boy's face as he slept. Dr. Yoshida had taken the boy's mask off when he had been brought in for treatment, and he'd immediately noticed that the boy had very feminine features. He'd also had the niggling feeling that he'd seen him before somewhere as he looked at the boy's exceedingly feminine face, which would likely plague him into adulthood. Because that feeling had bothered him like an itch he couldn't scratch, he racked his brain trying to figure out where it could have been that he'd seen the boy before. Finally, it came to him. The boy looked just like a very nice girl he'd once met. He was seated on a worn stool in front of the counter of a slightly run-down ramen stand in a foreign village. The nice girl who had led him here was seated next to him. They had introduced themselves to each other as they waited for the old man to finish making their ramen. Her name was Haku, which was rather strange, since that was a boy's name. "Tell me," the girl asked slightly nervously. "Do you have someone precious to you? Someone that you would do anything to protect?" He had been so nice to him back then, had been one of the very few good things that had happened to him and Kiri. He'd almost forgotten him, in all the general unpleasantness that had occurred later, and now, he'd almost killed him. He had completely lost control of himself, and had almost killed someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and mercy. He had almost killed a friend of his as well yesterday. Inari would have died if he hadn't regained control of himself at the last second. Morishita-san had warned him that something like this would happen if he let his rage control him after the first time this had happened, when he was in Kiri. She had told him to rein in his temper and find a safe outlet for it. He apparently hadn't. He had lost control again, and had let even more of the fox out, the fox that his mother and the yondaime had trusted him to keep sealed away. He had failed them. As he wallowed in his guilt as he waited for Haku to wake, the Zabuza guy groaned from the other bed in Dr. Yoshida's small clinic. He had just returned to consciousness, and was undoubtedly in a massive amount of pain. It had been touch and go with him last night, and his survival had not been certain. He had pulled through however, and, if his wounds didn't get infected or something, he should survive. They had nearly lost Haku due to his injuries and the chakra exhaustion last night as well, and he was still in danger until he woke up. The two of them wouldn't have been in nearly as bad a condition as they were currently in if he hadn't completely lost it. It was one thing to kill your enemies in battle, it was something else entirely when you lose it, almost kill your enemies, and become a danger to everyone around you including your allies like he had done. If he didn't find a way to stay in control of himself during these kinds of situations, one of the dead was going to end up being a friend or a teammate someday. Sakura stood outside the town's small, run-down medical building, uncertain about whether she should go inside or not. Naruto was inside, and she wasn't certain if she was ready to face him yet. What she had seen yesterday had really shaken her. Naruto had snapped. Naruto had more than snapped, Naruto had turned into a monster. What had happened to the nice, cheerful but annoying boy that she had remembered from the academy? Had he always been like this? Is this why everyone avoided him and told their children not to play with him? She had heard of Kekkai Genkai before, but none of the ones in Konoha that she'd heard about matched what she had seen. His mother had been a foreigner though. His mother had come from here in fact. The doctor who ran the clinic was old, probably old enough to remember Naruto's family. Maybe she would know whether or not Naruto had a whirlpool Kekkai Genkai. With her mind finally made up, she finally entered the building. The doctor was sitting in a chair resting, having spent the night tending to her two patients who had been in critical condition when they arrived. The two patients were occupying beds at either end of the room, and Naruto was sitting next to the boy's bed, watching the boy with a serious expression on his face. "Yoshida-san?" she said, trying to get the doctor's attention. I was wondering if I could ask you a question. She was slightly uncertain about asking with Naruto present, but it was probably better than going behind his back. If Naruto objected to the question, he could ask the doctor not to answer it, but she really wanted to know the answer however. What is it? Dr. Yoshida asked tiredly, sitting up straighter in the chair she had been slumped in. Well, I was wondering if you knew if the Uzumaki had a Kekii Genkai. What Naruto did yesterday didn't match any of the Konoha Kekii Genkai I've heard about. She replied, almost timidly. The Uzumaki were famous for their red hair, their sealing skills, and living to a very ripe old age, but I don't think that those were Kekii Genkai. Why? Dr. Yoshida replied after a minute of thought. Well, yesterday, Naruto grew claws and fangs, and there was this strange red chakra surrounding him, and I thought it might be a Kekii Genkai. She answered. Jinchuriki. Momochi Zabuza moaned from his bed. Dr. Yoshida gasped at this, looking shocked and sickened. What's jinchuriki? She asked. About the most horrible thing anyone could do to a child. Dr. Yoshida replied. To make a jinchuriki, you seal one of the biju into a living child, usually an infant, since the beast's chakra would normally kill an adult. The jinchuriki are used as weapons by their village. I'm not a weapon. Naruto growled from where he sat by Haku, apparently having listened to the entire conversation despite the rapt attention he seemed to be paying the unconscious boy. My mom and the yondaime sealed the fox inside me to keep Konoha safe. They wanted me to protect everyone from it. A pain-filled holy shit came from Zabuza's direction. Sasuke froze with his back against the wall. He had been standing by the open window of the clinic providing extra security in case one of the injured ninja decided to take one of the more popular hospital exits in an attempt to escape. What he just heard. That boy had the Kyuubi sealed inside him. The Kyuubi that had vanished after Uchiha Madara had used it in his battle against the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End, and had reappeared 12 years ago only to be disposed of by the yondaime who had given his life to do so, disposed of on the day that boy had been born. He remembered asking his father how the Kyuubi had died after he'd heard the rather sketchy story that had been told to his entire year during a special assembly that had taken place on the yondaime's birthday during his first year at the academy. He'd asked his father because he'd thought he would know how the Kyuubi had been killed because the academy instructor who'd told the story had refused to tell them how the yondaime had killed the Kyuubi. In fact, the man yelled at that boy for asking when he had told the combined classes the tale of the yondaime's sacrifice for the village. When he'd asked, his father had looked like he'd been about to say something about it, but he suddenly changed his mind and told him not to ask ever again, that the yondaime had defeated the Kyuubi, and that was all he needed to know about the subject. Had his father known about Naruto? Had that academy instructor known? And, if they had known, who else knew, and why hadn't they shared their knowledge? Zabuza had heard the rumors of the Kyuubi jinchuriki that had been cropping up lately, but hadn't put much stock in them, as there had not even been a whisper about a Kyuubi jinchuriki in the generations since the jinchuriki first started being made. The rumors had started after some sort of incident that took place during the chunin exams over a year ago. Supposedly, according to the rumors he'd heard, the Kyuubi jinchuriki was a small blonde boy. A blonde boy, like the one that had nearly taken him out on the bridge. The existence of the jinchuriki had not been confirmed until now, that is. He had nearly been killed by, and was currently lying helpless in the same room as the Kyuubi jinchuriki, who was sitting by the bedside of Haku, who was also helpless. He should have followed the damn fortune-teller's advice, and not accepted any business contracts on that day. But no, he had to go and accept Gato's offer, and look where it had gotten him. He'd been betrayed by his employer before he could betray the man, was down 2 followers, was badly injured, and was the prisoner of a bunch of Konoha shinobi, one of which was Sharingan Kakashi, and another of which was the Kyuubi jinchuriki, who he hadn't believed in. To make matters worse, he had done all that work and nearly gotten himself killed twice in order to get funds for another coup attempt, and he hadn't seen a single Rio for his effort. Today really sucked. In fact, the entire week had blown chunks. Chapter 13, Wave, Aftermath 2. Kakashi felt like slamming his head against the nearest wall, and probably would have if he could get up to do so. Thanks to someone's boneheaded stupidity, he now had to explain the Sandame's law to one of his students who happened to be one of the biggest gossips in Konoha. As if things hadn't been going badly enough already, Naruto had let the cat out of the bag with the help of Momochi Zabuza, and a doctor who knew way too much about jinchuriki for her own good. He could probably try to have Zabuza executed on the grounds of knowing classified information, but that would be flimsy at best, and Naruto probably knew it, because as far as Kiri and therefore Zabuza were concerned, that particular cat had been out of the bag and running around the house for over a year. The fact that Zabuza had said jinchuriki in speculation according to witness accounts rather than saying Naruto is the Kyuubi jinchuriki was a pesky technicality that might protect him from the Sandame's law, which probably couldn't be enforced in his case anyway because he wasn't a citizen of Konoha, but probably could considering the fact that he was currently a prisoner of Konoha's forces and therefore under their jurisdiction until he was either executed or repatriated. He could still kill the demon of the mist over it, but Naruto would raise an almighty stink and relations between the two of them were cool enough already because he was a villain in Naruto's eyes for taking him from a teacher he'd grown attached to. Kill 2 more people that Naruto was attached to, and he'd most likely end up being dead to the boy. He couldn't teach his sensei's son if the boy completely disavowed his existence. He would have to consult with the Hokage on that and see what he thought when he summoned his messenger. As far as he was concerned, the Hokage could be the villain in this situation and sort this whole Zabuza mess out. And the sooner he did it, the better. He would be able to summon a messenger to send a report back to Konoha tomorrow, or the next day at the latest. He planned on summoning Ohei as he was his fastest runner. His day had been completely screwed an hour earlier when he'd been trying to sleep and Sakura had come and asking about jinchuriki and Naruto in particular. He'd been forced to explain that yes, a 20-story tall fox made entirely of chakra had been sealed into Naruto on the day he had been born, and that no, Naruto wasn't usually a danger to himself or others, had not been since day one, and no, Naruto hadn't known about the Kyuubi himself until recently. Before he could get a word in edgewise about the Sandame's law regarding the subject, she'd left the room to go and do whatever. Sasuke had come in after he'd dozed off again and further ruined his day by demanding information about the Uzumaki. He found it rather odd that the boy didn't know anything more about Uchiha Madara and his ability to control the Kyuubi than what any school child knew, which was that the man had used the creature in a battle with the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End where he died. His clan and the law had apparently kept the boy sheltered against the suspicions against the Uchiha in regards to the Kyuubi's attack. Fortunately, Sasuke had stuck around for a brief overview of the law, and the reasons surrounding it, as that was part of the information he wanted to know. If it had been merely for Naruto's sake, the law wouldn't have required such a draconian punishment. The identities of the Kyuubi jinchuriki had been closely guarded secrets in Konoha for generations. The first jinchuriki had been rumored to have been the Shodai Hokage's wife Senju, née Uzumaki, Mito, but that had never been confirmed or denied. There had been rumors amongst the older generations that Hashirama and Mito's 2 children had whisker marks on their cheeks like Naruto's, but that couldn't be confirmed, though they had always been wearing heavy makeup in the few surviving photographs there were of them. Someone had obviously taken Mito's place as jinchuriki if she had been one in the first place since she died long before the Kyuubi attack, but it was not known at least to the majority of the village at large exactly who. There had been some whispers about Kushina-san that everyone in the know had refused to confirm or deny though. He knew he should have listened to his horoscope when it said that any journeys undertaken on that day would be filled with misfortune. He had been attacked, stabbed, practically sliced open, nearly drowned, paralyzed, suffered from chakra exhaustion twice, and now was forced to explain to the kiddies exactly why they couldn't tell their friends about Naruto's status as a jinchuriki, and also be forced to explain to the Hokage that they knew and exactly why they knew. And here he'd thought he'd be taking a nice little seaside vacation. This mission completely blew. Sakura wasn't sure how she should feel about Naruto, but she could understand how he came to be the way he was. Someone had taken an infant on the day it was born and, in a completely monstrous act, had sealed a demon inside of it with the consent of at least one of its parents. Just about everyone in the village who had been alive and able to understand what was going on at the time knew about this, and hated Naruto because of it. Naruto had grown up completely alone without either of his parents, who had also died in the Kyuubi's attack like so many other people had done that day. He'd been unloved, unwanted, and uncared for, and before he could make any friends, the adults had poisoned their children against him. It was the perfect conditions to make a monster, and yet, Naruto wasn't one, not exactly. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed her, or really broken her arm, instead of merely threatening to do so when she had attacked him that day at the academy. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed everyone on that bridge when he had lost control instead of just Gato's men. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared about this place, or its people in the first place, and therefore wouldn't have even bothered with the battle. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared if his teammates lived or died and wouldn't have taken their survival into consideration. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have sworn to protect Konoha either. While Naruto just barely kept a monster contained, Naruto himself was not a monster. What would her life have been like if the yondaime had asked her parents for permission instead of Naruto's? Would her parents have kept her despite the fact that the entire village would have hated her and wanted her gone? Would they have still loved her, or would they have feared her because of what she had kept contained? Would she have had any friends? Would she have managed to survive without friends the way Naruto had? Would she have viewed the protection of Konoha and its citizens as her responsibility the way Naruto had, despite the fact that most of them hated him, or would she have completely despised Konoha instead? Would she have been nearly as strong as Naruto was now? Would she have had his courage? Would she have had his empathy and his sense of duty, or would she have become the monster many people seem to think Naruto is? Sasuke sat in a tree to think, as he often did when he had a thorny problem that couldn't be ignored which he had to sort out. The conversation he'd had with Kakashi had both been rather informative, and had brought up a slew of questions. While he'd been pumping Kakashi for information about that boy, Kakashi had been trying to weasel information out of him that he honestly didn't know and therefore couldn't give. Kakashi's offhand comment about rumors about his father and the Kyuubi confused and upset him. His father would never have done something like that. Konoha was his home, and several Uchiha had died that day defending Konoha from the fox. His father would never have senselessly thrown away the lives of any of the members of his clan. He could understand how a civilian might think that though. Madara, who had been a Uchiha, had somehow controlled the Kyuubi and forced it to fight Senju Hashirama. People could then logically come to the assumption that Madara had passed the secret of how to do this on to the clan. If Madara had, however, he hadn't found it, and it definitely wasn't in the Uchiha's secret hiding place, as he'd already thoroughly searched it, looking for what that man had told him about. All he'd found down there was the secret of attaining the Mangekyo Sharingan, and a bunch of maps with patrol routes on them that made absolutely no sense, since they completely bypassed the worst parts of the village and heavily concentrated officers around the Hokage Tower, administration complex, and the shelter behind the Hokage monument. Another question that came to mind was why that boy? What had been so special about him that had made the yondaime pick him out of all of the infants in Konoha? Had it been because his parents had volunteered him before the yondaime could ask anyone else, or had it been for some other reason? He could have used power like that. He could have used it to completely destroy that man. He was a Uchiha and therefore should have been able to control the Kyuubi's powers the way Madara did somehow. He would have used the Kyuubi to turn that man into paste. But then again, the Shodai Hokage had taken control of the Kyuubi away from Madara, and killed him before he could get it back. There was a distinct possibility that that boy had been selected because he'd been born with whatever it was that had allowed the Shodai Hokage to seize control of the Kyuubi from Madara. If that were the case, that man could have found and used that boy if he'd had the Kyuubi sealed inside him, instead of that boy, that infuriating boy who was so far ahead of him it wasn't even funny, that boy who would more than likely achieve his goal before he achieved his ambition. That boy had always been going on about being Hokage, even when he was in the academy. Did he know something everyone else didn't? Had he been groomed for the position from the start? According to history and what he'd heard about the Uzumaki clan from Kakashi when the man had explained that Naruto hadn't really adopted him since the knowing consent of both parties was required, or kids would be passed back and forth through several clans each time another kid unthinkingly loaned out their clothes as Naruto had done, the Uzumaki had been closely related to and intermarried with the Senju. Two of the Hokage had been Senju, the third had studied under both of the first two Hokage, and the fourth had studied under one of the third students. As that boy was related to the Senju, and on a team under the student of the Yondaime, it would be logical to assume that he would be selected as the Sandaime's successor. Great. He'd been doing just about everything he could to alienate and piss off the next Hokage. Things were going to go real well for him when he restored his clan. Not. He now knew why Naruto had been placed on the team, since it was glaringly obvious when you bothered to stop and think about it. He didn't bother to question why he was on the team, as the answer to that question could be summed up in one word: Sharingan. Considering the fact that he was the last of the Uchiha besides that man, and that boy was the future Hokage, what the hell was Sakura doing on the team? Haku groaned as he awoke, and winced as the light attacked his eyes as usual since, for some strange reason, his eyes became extremely light-sensitive when he suffered from chakra exhaustion. He could barely see, but he could tell that he was in a bed somewhere within the town that was located near the bridge, and that someone other than Zabuza-sama had brought him here, since Zabuza-sama was aware of his light sensitivity, and would never have stuck him next to an open window, and left the blinds up. Had he completely failed Zabuza-sama? Had Zabuza-sama died? What would he do now that he'd failed? Pull the shades, the light's hurting the kid's eyes, said a voice that Haku had feared that he'd never hear again, cutting through his rising panic. As he nearly fainted in relief that he hadn't completely failed his master, someone hastily moved to close the blinds. He caught a flash of yellow, dark orange, and brown. Soon, the shades were drawn, and he was better able to focus on who it was. It was Naruto. While he was afraid of Naruto because of what the boy could do, he understood. He had seen the look of rage, pain, and grief that had been on the boy's face when he had transformed and attacked Zabuza-sama when he believed that his sensei had been killed. If it had been Zabuza-sama who had been killed, or appeared to have been killed instead, he would have done the same thing. He couldn't call Naruto a monster because, what would that make him, since he too had a Kekkai Genkai? And Naruto wasn't a monster, he hadn't killed indiscriminately. He had only killed those who had threatened him and his, albeit in a rather vicious manner. "I'm sorry, Haku," Naruto said sadly when he realized that he was looking at him. "Please forgive me." What reason did Naruto have to apologize to him? He'd done nothing but hurt the boy. He'd deceived him the day he'd met him, and used him as a distraction in order to escape. He'd wandered around the home of the boy's ancestors as if it were his own private playground without once paying his respects to them. He'd attacked the boy, attacked his teammates, and attacked his sensei, making him believe that he'd killed the man. What reason did Naruto have for begging his forgiveness? It should be the other way around, he should be the one begging Naruto for forgiveness. "I forgive you," he finally said after yanking himself out of his litany of the cruelties he had heaped upon the younger boy, seeing that his lack of an answer had caused the boy even more pain. Chapter 14, Wave, Clash of the A and BU. The Sandaime Hokage stared at the report that one of Kakashi's Ninken had brought in, which sat innocuously at the edge of his desk, as if it were a poisonous snake, almost afraid to open it and discover what sort of nightmare it contained. Reports were usually given at the end of a mission after everything was said and done and everyone had all gone home either happy or dead depending on the type of mission assigned. When they arrived in the middle of a mission, it meant that something had gone very seriously wrong and that someone needed to head out there post-haste to clean up the mess. He just knew that he really didn't want to find out what sort of mess Kakashi and his team could create in a week and a half though. What could go so wrong on a C-ranked mission that was basically little more than a glorified walk with a seaside vacation tacked onto the end of it that would result in a mid-mission report? The customer in question had been particularly trying, but not so much, so that he'd be turned away for fear of his escort killing him before he reached his destination. Oh god, Sasuke hadn't snapped and killed the client, had he? Kakashi had been telling him that the boy had some anger issues, but he'd waved them off as not being too serious, as the boy had not been behaving overly aggressively. Knowing that he'd have to get it over with eventually and dreading what he would find, he carefully broke the seal on the scroll. After unfurling the scroll, he skimmed the document, stopped, and began to read it more thoroughly, hoping to all that was holy that he had misread what had been written while he'd been skimming the report. He hadn't. Naruto's curse had struck big time, and the C rank had turned into an A rank, and then, when everyone had thought it was over, it had really hit the fan. There had been another incident with Naruto on the bridge, and there had been a large number of witnesses this time. Naruto's teammates were now aware of his status as the QB Jinchuriki. And to make matters worse, Kakashi had a pair of high-risk prisoners he didn't know what to do with, since Naruto had grown rather attached to one of them, making executing them rather problematic for the man whom Naruto had yet to warm up to. Damn. He knew that he wouldn't have wanted to know. Things would have been a whole lot easier if it had just been one of the genin snapping and killing the client. He could have found a way to sweep that under the rug at least. It had happened often enough over the years. As for the prisoners that Kakashi had taken, he could deal with those. He would send a team of ANBU to retrieve Zabuza and his young accomplice. That would give him time to figure out what he was going to do with them, and how to explain to Naruto exactly why he had to do what he had done afterward. Danzo choked slightly on his morning tea as he read the report he'd picked up after a nice relaxing 3-day weekend at a bed and breakfast in a nearby town. Things had been going slowly lately, so he had rather foolishly thought that he could take the time off to relax and not bother focusing on work as he had done for the last several decades. He'd thought he'd set everything up so that it would go smoothly without him there to supervise every little detail for a few days, but he was wrong. This was what he got for trying to take a vacation once in the nearly 60 years that he'd been a shinobi. Gato was dead, and without him there to hire thugs to threaten a few families and break a few bones when bribes didn't work, a number of stalled investigations into his businesses were now rapidly progressing. Because of this, he could stand to lose millions in funding for Root. Not only had he heavily invested in Gato's corporations and the man's less-than-legal activities, but Gato had hired a number of his operatives for some of his more clandestine operations. Without Gato to head Gato Corporation, the company was going to fall apart, especially after the results of the various investigations became public knowledge. Even if he managed to cash out all of his Gato Corporation stock, the price had already fallen to a point where it would be at a loss on his initial investment following the news of Gato's demise. Adding to this little shitfest was the fact that a thorn in his side that he thought Gato would deal with knowing the man's tendencies was still alive. Momochi Zabuza had the potential to become the Mizukage should he finally manage to get his coup off the ground. Unlike most potential Mizukage candidates, the man was ruthless and capable, and while he was willing to sell himself to the highest bidder to get the funds he needed, he was a staunch patriot in his own way. What's worse, the man had his own sense of honor that would preclude him dealing with him, and the loyalty of his followers even though he had flat out told them that they were nothing more to him than tools to help him reach his ambition. All in all, Momochi Zabuza not a good candidate for the position in his opinion. Kirigakure needed a relatively weak Mizukage, so they would not be a threat to Konoha, and that was most definitely not Zabuza. Another person that was rapidly becoming a thorn in his side was the Jinchuriki. It was because of the boy that the most major problem that had cropped up during his short vacation that he wished he was back on, if only because he didn't want to deal with this mess. He had known that boy would be trouble the instant he saw the drooling bundle of joy who looked so much like his mother, who had been a headache and a half in his opinion. When he had seen him again with the boy who had taken him under his wing, he'd upwardly revised the amount of trouble the Jinchuriki would be. The reality, however, was turning out to be much worse. Rubbing his temples in order to ward off an impending headache, he called for several teams of Root operatives whom he ordered to clear out all evidence of their dealings from Gato's holdings. He then called for a team which he then ordered to take out Zabuza, before the man could escape, and cause even more problems that he and Konoha didn't need. That team would of course be at a greater risk than the other one because they were going to be wearing the emblem of a foreign nation, so that the ANBU team that the Hokage had sent out wouldn't be alerted to Root's continued existence. Over in Water Country, the government in Kirigakure had been in complete disarray since the Yonde Mizukage Yagura had bit the big one a few months back, and the Sanbai escaped its seal, cutting a swathe of destruction through the village on its way down to the sea. Considering the situation, it was completely understandable that the report regarding Zabuza's possible presence in Wave had gotten kicked around for a few weeks before it finally reached the Hunter Nin. After bouncing around several departments, the report finally reached the desk of a rather capable captain who had taken charge of the Hunter Nin until an acceptable candidate for the position of Godame Mizukage could be found. After finishing the paperwork he had in front of him, he opened and read the report, swore at its age, and assigned a reasonably skilled team to check out Wave and see if Zabuza's trail could be picked up there. Momochi Zabuza had been a thorn in his backside for far too long. It is extremely fortunate for Zabuza that the squad leader of the ANBU that the Hokage had sent, who was codenamed Tenzo, had been a friend of Kakashi's when the other man had been in ANBU. Tenzo had hurried his team up a bit because he had wanted to make certain that Kakashi was really alright, and that extra bit of speed had meant that the Hokage's ANBU had managed to reach Zabuza first rather than the Kiri Hunter Nin or Root. Tenzo, who had been chosen for this mission because his Mokuton abilities would make the prisoner transfer process easier, had hurried his team because he was concerned for his old friend, since I'm Fine could cover a wide range of conditions with Hatake Kakashi, ranging from almost dead from blood loss and chakra exhaustion, to actually being fine, and his teammates had been willing to go along with this because they were somewhat fond of the former ANBU captain as well. Without any griping from any of the team, who had all wanted to make sure that their senpai was well, they had made excellent time to the small port town in Wave. After checking in with Kakashi and catching up with him a bit, Tenzo had learned that the prisoners in question were at the town's medical clinic, where they were being seen to by the town's only doctor, and being guarded by Uzumaki Naruto, who had grown attached to Zabuza's young accomplice Haku, whom he'd apparently met during the chunin exams in Kiri. Leaving Kakashi's side, he and his team swiftly made their way to the clinic to relieve the conflicted young genin who might end up making a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his career of his burdensome duty. As he and his team were securing the two missed ninja for transport, two teams of Hunter Nin from Kiri showed up. After trading a few hand signs, both teams started fighting each other. Tenzo wasn't sure which side to join in this matter. While only one of the groups were a legitimate team of Hunter Nin from Kiri, the other group that was fighting was using language from Konoha and therefore could be on a clandestine mission he'd not been informed of. The fact that he hadn't been informed of a mission that could potentially affect his own by the Hokage, no matter how clandestine, positively smacked of it being illicit. At this point, either group would be needing the aid of himself and his teammates. Should he aid the group from Konoha, whom he would have been told about if they had been on a legitimate mission, or should he aid the group from Kiri, since he'd more than likely have to arrest the group from Konoha since it wasn't supposed to be here? Perhaps the best solution in this case would be to deal with all of them and sort them out afterward. Jinji had been a Hunter Nin close to 20 years. Having been a ninja for so long, he had worked alongside Zabuza for far longer than he'd hunted Zabuza, and knew exactly how tough the guy actually was. When he had been ordered to try and track the man in Wave, he had been understandably nervous. It was his duty to bring his former comrade in, however, and he was one of the best for the job to which he'd been assigned. When he and his team had arrived in Wave and learned that Zabuza was hanging around in the local hospital because he'd run afoul of a genin team from Konoha, he couldn't believe his luck. Actually, the first thing he couldn't believe was his ears, until someone had mentioned that Sharingan Kakashi was the instructor for that particular genin team, and that the team had a Uchiha on it as well. When the team arrived at the hospital to retrieve their quarry, they arrived only to discover that their luck had not held. When they had reached the hospital, there had been an ANBU team from Konoha there preparing Momochi Zabuza and his accomplice for transport. Not only that, but there was another hunter team that he would have to share the credit with should they manage to wrest Zabuza away from the Konoha team hanging around as well. He could have sworn that the captain had only sent one team out because the lead was so old though. Just who the heck are you? He signed to the apparent leader of the hunter team that was trying to impose Kiri's claim over Zabuza and not getting results. The response he got back was a rather shaky "Hi, I sent to help." While the relative uncertainty of that response would be understandable if the hunter nin in question were civilian-born, the leader of the other team had prefaced his statement with a gesture he knew was a Konoha swear, as a friend of his had made it his duty to learn the swear signs of every country, and had taught him a good number of them. The anger he'd been feeling when he'd realized that his team had arrived a little too late rose to murderous levels. The Konoha ninja he could ignore for the moment since they didn't need that sort of mess, and the Konoha guys had gotten Zabuza fair and square. The other group, however, a bunch of fucking imposters, had been standing there trying to take the kill they would have snatched from the Konoha ninja if they had dropped their guard for even 1 second. Hopping mad at the imposters, he signaled his men to attack the fake hunter nin. He was Root, and he served Danzo-sama as an extension of his will for the good of Konoha. That was all he needed to know about himself. He had no need of emotions, and therefore swallowed the slight uncertainty he'd felt when a team of genuine Kirigakure hunter nin had shown up before the target could be eliminated. Had it just been the Konoha team that he'd needed to fool, things would have been fine, but now, he was not the best choice for this job. While he could almost perfectly imitate a Kiri hunter nin in movements, tone of voice, and accent, there was one flaw in his training. He was not fluent in Kiri. Much to his dread, which he rather swiftly buried as soon as it had appeared, the leader of the real team of Kirigakure hunter nin signed something that looked like an interrogative. The two most likely choices considering the situation were "Who are you?" and "Why are you here?" He hedged his bets and signed back with both his personal call sign and the answer as to why he would be here were he a real hunter nin from Kiri. He had apparently made a mistake, however, because the next thing he knew, he and his team were in a fight for their lives against the Kiri hunter nin. A few minutes later, the Konoha ANBU joined the fray, and he didn't know exactly which side they were on since they seemed to be fighting just about everyone. After the initial amazement at the ANBU fight that had suddenly erupted wore off and common sense stepped in, Naruto quickly got Zabuza and Haku under cover. At that moment, he didn't need anyone to tell him that, to put it politely, the fecal matter had hit the ventilation device. There were 3 teams of ANBU duking it out in the middle of the street, and anywhere near the immediate vicinity of that fight was most definitely not a good place for injured people, or anyone else for that matter to be. Kunai were flying everywhere, as were fireballs and water jutsu, and defensive earth walls and trees for some strange reason. And, when he didn't think it could get any worse, the mist started up, obscuring the entire area and making it near impossible to see when to dodge. That didn't stop the fight, however, as he could still hear the clang of steel, the roar of fire and water, and the rumble of earth being torn from its moorings. What the hell was that all about? He wondered as the battle began to move off into the distance. After several long moments of struggle, Tenzo finally managed to wrap one of the fake Kiri hunter nin securely in the branches of his Mokuton technique, and bury him in the ground until only his head was showing. After the imposter was secure, he pulled off the man's mask. After studying the man's features, he realized that he didn't recognize him as a fellow ANBU or one of the rank and file, but noted that he resembled someone he had known during his days at the academy. There were several top-secret groups that were rumored to exist in Konoha, and it was possible that the man belonged to one of them. After memorizing the man's appearance, he rendered the man unconscious and drugged him for capture, hoping that he wasn't making a mistake in doing so, and that he hadn't harmed a fellow Konoha ninja who had been sent to help his team. He would have to report his findings to the Hokage, but it was possible that the man already knew. As soon as the fake hunter nin was dealt with, he moved back to the battle that was following the path of the retreating fake hunter nin whose team his captive had been a member. He was Root, and he served Danzo as an extension of his will for the good of Konoha. He had failed. He had been captured and was unable to complete his objective. He knew what to do in case of capture. He bit down on a seal inside his cheek, and it released a small amount of a fast-acting poison into his system. It was enough. He was dead. Back at the main battle, the Kirigakure hunter Nin Genji hurled a kunai at one of the Konoha shinobi that chased him through the mist. It didn't matter to him whether it was one of the fake hunter Nin or the team of ANBU who had joined the fight, adding to the general confusion when they attacked both his team and the team of imposters. They were all the same as far as he was concerned. The kunai failed to hit its target, and he nearly received a fireball to the posterior courtesy of a katon jutsu in return. The way things were going, the battle was turning into little more than a farce as everybody tried to fight everybody else in what was rapidly becoming a free-for-all that was going in circles and causing a great deal of collateral damage and little else. To add to the confusion, there were civilians fleeing everywhere. Zabuza or no Zabuza, he was not going to let this continue. He was calling a retreat before something happened that brought humiliation to his village or worse, caused an international incident that sparked a war which Kiri most definitely didn't need at this time. As soon as his team extracted themselves from this debacle, they would regroup, head home, inform the captain that Konoha had captured their quarry, and let the diplomats deal with it after they got that whole Mizukage mess sorted out. Despite the fact that he was loath to leave a fight unfinished, he called a general retreat, and made for the sea with his remaining teammates and one of the Konoha ninja following behind. Chapter 15, Wave, Return to Konoha. A week and a half after the three-way ANBU battle, Kakashi sighed in relief as he set foot on the newly completed bridge, and took the first step on his journey home, glad that the mission from hell that he just completed with the completion of the bridge was finally over. He would say that Wave was a nice place to visit, not to live, but as far as he was concerned, it was neither. Give him Konoha any day of the week. Konoha, where food was plentiful, he wasn't attacked by missing Nin, and ANBU didn't hold battles royal in the street. God, he'd even take the constant bickering of his students, which seemed to have cooled down a bit recently, over coming back here. He'd even be willing to take 3 straight days of Mato Guy doing nothing but pestering him about stupid challenges over coming back here. Hell, he almost felt like kissing Mato Guy the next time he saw him. Almost. Come to think of it, he'd rather go on a vacation to IWA than come back here. In his cell in Konoha, Zabuza studied the chakra suppression seal that had been placed on him by the ANBU team that had transported him to Konoha, since it gave him something to do while he waited. He was in ANBU custody, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before he was interrogated. Haku, who was the weaker of the two of them, had been taken already and had been gone for over an hour. As he finished examining the seal with little more than academic interest because his skills lay elsewhere, Haku returned to their holding cell looking pale and slightly shaken. He quickly squashed his feeling of worry at the sight of this, as well as the number of increasingly horrifying scenarios that had cropped up as he gazed upon his servant's pale and shaken countenance, which increased his own concerns for his own fate. Whatever they had done to the boy had to have been really bad for him to have reacted this way, and while he didn't want to know because it would only bring down his own morale, he knew that he needed to know in order to know what to expect for his own interrogation. "What did they do to you?" he asked. "They took me to see the Hokage," Haku replied quietly. "And?" he asked, wondering what the Hokage had done to the boy to make him this upset. "He offered me a plot of land and a list of available women," Haku replied, holding up the sheaf of papers that in his distracted state he previously hadn't noticed were in the boy's hand. "What did you say?" he asked, wondering if his tool, his weapon, his Haku had left him. "I told him no, but he handed me the papers and told me to look them over and think about it," Haku replied. Looking at those papers that could even now become the cause of Haku's eventual betrayal and departure, he understood why Haku was upset. Haku had already thought about it. It may have been for only a second or two, but the fact that he had even paused to seriously consider the offer had been enough to upset the boy whose life had revolved entirely around him for so long. Back in Wave, Tazuna watched as Inari cried over the fact that his hero was leaving for Konoha. The boy had been good for Inari, had pulled him out of his shell, and started to turn him back to the somewhat happy boy he remembered from back before Gato had tried to destroy them. Naruto had been good for Wave as a whole as well. He had killed Gato, driven off his mercenaries, and given Inari and everyone else the courage to stand up and fight for what was theirs. Should Naruto return, there wasn't a home in the village that wouldn't open their doors to him despite the fact that he possessed an extremely dangerous unknown and unnatural power. The other ninja from Konoha, however, let's just say that the old-timers were strongly reminded of the reason why Wave had not given permission for another ninja village to form after Yuzu fell and the former country of Whirlpool had reformed under a new name after being almost completely crushed. That reason could be summed up in only 2 words, and those words were collateral and damage. There tended to be a lot of it when ninja were around. While only minimal and mostly cosmetic repair work had to be made to the bridge as a result of Naruto's rampage, an entire section of bridge had needed to be replaced thanks to the structural weakening and the internal damage caused by Kakashi's dogs burrowing into it. Then, on top of the damage to the bridge, there was the damage that had been caused to the town during the 3-way A and BU free-for-all. Fortunately, this damage wasn't anywhere near as bad as it could have been, since the strange one with the red and blue cat mask had used a strange jutsu that was capable of creating habitable buildings that were up to code, and the team medic had tended to the injured civilians before they completely swamped Dr. Yoshida. And people wondered why insurance premiums in the countries that had ninja villages were sky high. As he watched Naruto and his team travel down the bridge he had decided to name after the boy who had defeated Gato and his minions and paved a way for a brighter future in Wave, and back toward Fire Country. He hoped that when he kept his promise to Inari and returned someday, he wouldn't bring anyone else with him. Things broke often enough around here without any outside interference, and they didn't need another bunch of ninja helping the process along. Home. Finally. Naruto muttered as he and the team took their first steps into Fire Country. And I thought my first C rank was bad. Why? Sakura asked. What happened on your first C rank? Satoshi gambled away all the travel funds, and I had to throw myself under a horse to get more money. He replied. I'd heard about the first C rank curse, but I didn't believe it until then. How do you get money by throwing yourself under a horse? Sasuke asked. You find the sort of drunk who thinks he can buy his way out of anything, and play dead while your teammates shake him for cash. He replied. But that's... Sakura started, staring at him both horrified and at a loss for words. Sasuke just gave him a dubious glance as if he wasn't sure he should believe him or not. Seems Shimura's still up to his old tricks. Kakashi said. Who's Shimura? Sakura asked. Naruto's former sensei. Kakashi replied. He's something of a con artist. A con artist? Sakura said, sounding stunned. His mother came from a family of tea country grifters. Kakashi said, sounding somewhat disapproving. She taught him a few tricks of the trade. Some are useful for a shinobi career, and some most definitely are not. What the hell was Kakashi's problem? He couldn't still be sore about the way Tetsuo-sensei had weaseled a favor out of him. That was like ages ago. Tetsuo-sensei had told him the story last year, and it had been pretty damn funny. After that exchange on the border of Fire Country, the team continued on their way, and eventually reached Konoha where Naruto found his old team waiting for him. Tetsuo-sensei, he yelled as he raced up to his teacher, and gave him one of the flying tackle hugs he was still famous for despite all efforts to curb this impulse. Shimura Tetsuo naturally went flying backward and hit the ground with Naruto on top of him squeezing the stuffing out of him. Suzume and Satoshi soon turned it into a group hug, which rapidly devolved into the bunch of them roughhousing in front of the village gates. Missed you too, kid. Tetsuo replied as he ruffled Naruto's hair when they had finished playing. Now what's this I hear about you taking out an A-ranked missing nin and the head of a multinational corporation? Kakashi growled as he watched Naruto and his former teammates get up from where they had piled on top of their former sensei and started play fighting. What a perfect way to end the trip from hell. He'd thought that he'd made progress with Naruto when the boy had practically hovered over him when he was ill, but the instant Shimura showed up, Naruto hadn't given him one of those flying tackle hugs since he'd taught him the Kagebunshin. Sure, he threw the kid into a tree headfirst when he did so that one time, but still. He'd be happy if the boy had shown him even half the amount of affection and respect he showed Shimura. The boy hadn't even shown him a quarter of the regard he gave the other man so far. Sakura watched Naruto greet his Tetsuo-sensei and a pair of chunin who'd been standing with the man in amazement. She had never seen him that happy, not even at the academy. The closest to being that happy she'd ever seen Naruto had been when he was with Umino-sensei. Watching him now, it was almost as if she were looking at an entirely different person. Had being on this team really made him that miserable? Had she made him that miserable? The entire time he'd been with her, Sasuke-kun and Kakashi-sensei, he'd been unhappy and suffering, and she had never once done anything to help, even back during the days at the academy when he had followed her around like a lost puppy, taking all the abuse she dished out because it was a form of acknowledgement of his existence at least. "Sakura-chan, will you go out with me?" Naruto said for what had to be the millionth time as they returned from target practice. "No." Smack. "Sakura-chan, I got you something," Naruto said, grinning from ear to ear as he held up a small white box. She opened the box, and a white frog jumped out. She shrieked. "Naruto! You jerk!" Smack. Naruto looked stunned and disappointed by her reaction to the gift. "Sakura-chan, I..." Naruto started as he ran up to her yet again. Smack. "Sakura-chan." Naruto started as he moved to sit next to her. Smack. "Sakura-chan." Naruto started as he got off his favorite swing and raced over to her. Smack. Smack. Naruto may have been downright annoying back then, but she had been vicious and cruel, and people had allowed her to be this way because it was just Naruto. If she had done what she had done to someone else, her parents would have severely reprimanded her. Hell, the other kids' parents would have reprimanded her as well. So would the academy instructors and just about every other adult who witnessed her behavior. But because it was just Naruto. Despite the fact that he should be entirely focused on teaching the children in front of him, Iruka was subtly watching the clock as he waited for the day to end. Naruto was expected to get back today, and he wanted to see how the boy was doing since he'd heard some disturbing rumors involving the mission that Naruto had been on. He wanted to make sure the Naruto was alright, especially since his former pupil hadn't been adjusting to his new team all that well, and there would undoubtedly have been friction between Naruto and his teammates on their first mission outside the village no matter how well the mission had gone. What had the Hokage been thinking putting Naruto on a team with Uchiha Sasuke and Hirono Sakura? Both Sasuke and Sakura hated Naruto. Back when the boy was at the academy, if one wasn't abusing him, the other was, and Sasuke hadn't taken Naruto's early graduation all that well. In fact, he'd completely denied that it had happened. Instead of being given a class of returnees as he had been expecting, he had been sent to replace an instructor who was out on maternity leave as an instructor for the autumn rotation cycle class of 8 to 9-year-olds when the academy came back in session in January. He suspected that the reason for this had been because of Konoha, who had joined the class in January as well. The Hokage had trusted him to educate Naruto, and now, because he hadn't failed the trust, he was being trusted to educate the Hokage's grandson as well, and he would do his best not to fail him there either. The Hokage's grandson was another reason he was constantly watching the clock, because Naruto had taught Konoha the trick to moving the hands of the clock forward without the teacher noticing, and the boy had decided to become a miniature copy of Naruto, pranks and all. Fortunately, he had learned to wear a watch years ago. Konoha sat in his seat practically vibrating in excitement as the seconds ticked down towards the end of the school day. Naruto would be back soon, he just knew it. Naruto would be back, and they would have a lot of fun together, and Naruto would teach him something new, and tell him about all of the adventures he had. 59 minutes and 37 seconds to go before he could get out of here and see if Naruto had returned. 36. 35. 34. The Hokage sighed when Team 7 left his office after making their report. Thanks to them, he would be forced to open negotiations with Kiri, which would be somewhat more difficult than usual since there was a vacancy where there should be a Mizukage, because he had 2 missing nin from Kiri that he didn't exactly know what to do with. The fact that he'd offered one of them the standard Kekii Genkai bonus package could raise issues considering the fact that Zabuza's follower wasn't officially a ninja and could technically still be considered a citizen of Water Country since he hadn't officially renounced that right. Then, there was that free-for-all in Wave that he was certain was entirely Danzo's fault, as it had been his ninjas who had started the whole fracas when they pretended to be a team of hunter nin from Kiri piled on top of what was already a touchy situation. Either one of these issues would be a headache to deal with, both of them combined made the situation a migraine of epic proportions. Why was it that whenever Naruto got within a mile of a citizen from Kirigakure, he was stuck dealing with some sort of diplomatic incident? Chapter 16, Chunin Exams, Suna Arrivals. Sakura panted as she dodged Kamizuki Suzume's blow. The spar, as always, was far more intense than any of the workouts she had gotten during her regular training. In addition to her daily training with Team 7, and the D-rank missions she was now grateful for after having experienced a C-rank and seeing how badly missions could go wrong once one left Konoha's gates, she trained with Suzume 3 afternoons a week when the other girl wasn't on missions. Naruto had introduced them to each other shortly after she had asked him what she would need to do in order to prepare for the Chunin exams when they returned to Konoha back in April, several weeks after she had come to the epiphany that her life, whichever course it ended up taking, could only begin after she passed the Chunin exams. She remembered the look on Naruto's face when he'd asked her if she was serious. That look of shock and incredulity that had crossed the boy's face had hurt. Had she really acted as if she hadn't taken being a ninja seriously so much that when she finally wanted to do something above and beyond what she had been doing she was met with surprise and disbelief? Sure, she had spent an inordinate amount of time on the pursuit of her future husband, but she had still studied and trained. Apparently not enough, however, as the mission in Wave and her training with Naruto's former teammate clearly illustrated. But she had trained nonetheless. Eventually, after taking several blows, her training session with Suzume ended, and both girls parted ways. She had learned from Naruto that Suzume's goal was to start her own dojo after she retired from the shinobi forces, and she believed the girl could do it. Not only was Suzume skilled in the martial arts, but she was a good teacher, and she could also see why Naruto liked her so much, because she was a good and kind if somewhat strict person as well. After parting ways with Suzume, she headed home for dinner. When she arrived, her mom was in the kitchen preparing the meal which, much to her relief, seemed to be traditional fare rather than one of her frequent experiments this evening. Sometimes, her mother's kitchen experiments were appreciated, but most often, they were not. After inspecting the evening meal and finding it to be edible, she went upstairs to shower and change, and when she came down, dinner was ready. "So, how was your day?" her mother asked her when everyone was settled at the table. Her father tried to look interested in her reply, but had grown so used to years of girl talk since he was completely outnumbered in that area that he automatically tuned everything out. She could tell that he was tuning her out again, because her dad's eyes had that slightly glazed-over look that said, "I'll nod at appropriate intervals so I don't end up on the couch, otherwise, I'm not listening." Training went better than usual, as it's been going since Sasuke quit trying to pick fights with Naruto. They still don't seem to like each other, but at least they're not arguing. She started, as she picked up her rice bowl. "Our mission today was walking dogs, it wasn't so bad. There was a rather funny incident where a dog that was almost the size of a horse tried to pull Kakashi-sensei's arms out of their sockets." She continued before taking a bite of her rice, which fortunately didn't have any exotic spices added to it this evening. "After the mission, I trained with Suzume-san for a bit." "I don't see why you hang out with that girl," her mother said disapprovingly. "Someone who spends that much time with that Uzumaki boy isn't what, mother? Suzume is a loyal shinobi of Konoha and a chunin," she said, upset that her mother was harping on that again. "She has volunteered to train me when she could be occupying what little free time she has with something more worthwhile out of the kindness of her heart." "But still," her mother started. She sighed. She loved her mother, but there were times when the woman could be absolutely trying. She wasn't going to stop hanging out with Suzume. Suzume was helping her get ready to pass the chunin exams when she took them next year. End of discussion. Momochi's abusa shifted uncomfortably as he waited in the Mizukige's office more than 2 months after he'd been captured by that team from Konoha, and less than a week after Konoha had turned him over to Kiri. Practically the instant the Godame had been selected, the Hokage had shipped him back to Kiri with an admonition of "Don't let us catch you again." Instead of being immediately executed as he had expected to be upon arrival, he had been brought to meet with the Godame Mizukige, whoever he was. After what had been an interminable wait, the door to the room finally opened, and a very familiar woman with exceedingly long auburn hair and green eyes who was dressed in rather revealing clothing walked in. Instead of announcing the Mizukige's imminent arrival, the woman calmly walked across the room and seated herself at the desk that had once belonged to Yagura, and whoever that asshole who had been controlling him had been. He'd liked Yagura before he became Mizukige, and had only reluctantly decided to kill him and take his place to end the bloodshed his rule had caused. The idea of being Mizukige himself hadn't been all that bad either. Mizukige Momochi had a rather nice ring to it, and he probably would have succeeded in his endeavor despite the sanbai, if the jerk who had been pulling Yagura's strings hadn't interfered. He was sharply pulled out of his musings about what had happened the last time he'd set foot in this office by a sudden realization. Mei was the Mizukige. Mei was a few years older than him, and he'd dated her a couple of times, so he knew that she was the sort of woman who was very capable at whatever she set her mind to. But Mizukige, most of my current advisors have advised me to have you publicly executed to further cement my position. The new Mizukige said. You seem to have a great deal of popular support, and would therefore be a threat to me. I am not about to hand over my new hat so soon after I got it, and you know full well that if it came down to a fight, I would win. Mei continued, leaning forward slightly as she shifted position, and probably rather deliberately giving him a better view of her cleavage. I am always in need of capable advisors. Mei said, shifting back to a less revealing position. That is why I came up with a solution that would satisfy both of us, and some of the traditionalists, who don't believe a woman should be in power as well. Should you refuse my offer or attempt to take my position, I will be forced to kill you, and that is something I would seriously regret, especially considering our friendship. It was at that point that the new Mizukige opened a drawer of her desk, pulled out a small velvet box, and tossed it to him. He caught it and cautiously opened it, hoping that it wasn't trapped or something. What was inside was a trap, but not one in the traditional sense. It was a gold ring. He now had 2 choices: accept the offer it represented, or die. Congratulations, Sabuza-sama, Haku said before he could give his answer. It had been the angered yells that had drawn Naruto's attention while he had been wandering the village with no destination in particular, since he couldn't think of anything else to do since he'd finished his training for the day and hadn't been in the mood to sit still with a book. When he arrived at the site of the confrontation, which was taking place on the road just inside the main gate that had attracted his notice, it had been to see Satoshi being attacked by someone from the arriving Suna delegation who was dressed in an outfit that resembled the costume of a bunraku puppeteer. The bunraku boy's teammates and Jounin sensei held back to remain with the boy, while the main group, which seemed to consist of 8 or 9 other teams, made their way past them and to the administration complex. He could easily guess why Satoshi had been attacked, because it was almost always the reason why Satoshi ended up being involved in fights these days. He'd gotten caught swiping something. Damn it, Satoshi! He yelled as he moved to aid the chunin. How many times have you been told not to steal from our allies? Sorry about that, he said to the members of the Suna team when he arrived. Satoshi here's a bit of a kleptomaniac. It's okay, the Jounin replied with an amused smile. Kankuro here needed a lesson on why hiding his more valuable possessions is a good idea. As he and the Suna Jounin conversed, several chunin, who had apparently been alerted to the confrontation by the gate guards, broke the fight up, and from the looks of things, Satoshi would be spending at least a week in jail. It would probably be good for him. Tetsuo-sensei was always saying that he needed something to shake him up and teach him his lesson. Jail and a black mark on his record probably wouldn't be enough, however, which was a pity since despite his compulsion to steal anything and everything, Satoshi was a very good ninja. He'd hate to see him dismissed from the ranks over something like this. How about I show you a shortcut to the administration complex, so you can get signed in, and afterward I'll show you where the best places to eat are. He said after Satoshi had been hauled away, hoping to soothe relations between them and Konoha a bit. Thank you. The jounin said. I really don't want us to be too much trouble though. No trouble at all. He replied. I didn't have anything else to do this evening, and Satoshi used to be my teammate until he got promoted, so it's the least I can do. As he followed the blonde boy's lead, Gaara studied the boy named Naruto, wondering what the boy had done to earn such antipathy from the civilian population. When he'd first noticed the stares of the villagers, he had thought that they had been directed at him, and had a great deal of difficulty not killing the people outright as mother called for their blood. If he had done so, the plan that had been put in place by his father and the village elders would be ruined, and they would be forced to flee. While he personally didn't care if that happened, the results of his ruining his father's plans would cause more irritation than they were worth, as he would never hear the end of it. And, if he killed father in order to shut him up, he would never hear the end of that either, even if he eliminated the entire population of Suna. Mother would most likely bring it up to annoy him, and mother wasn't going anywhere. It was when he heard the comments that he realized that the cold stares from the civilians weren't directed at him, but at their guide through the village instead. How could the cheerful boy who was currently guiding them to his favorite restaurant on their way their new quarters ignore all of that? How could he go day to day listening to that, and not want to kill the people around him? He wanted to kill them after less than 5 minutes. Heck, he'd wanted to kill them after less than 5 seconds. Without seeming to want anything in return, the boy named Naruto had offered to show them around. Not Kankuro, not Temari, not Baki, all of them. He knew that the boy couldn't have failed to notice the fear with which his siblings and teammates had regarded him, but despite that, the boy had still treated him with the same kindness as he had the others. Even though he felt hesitation because of this, there was still the question over whether or not the boy was strong enough that killing him would validate his existence. Mother was uncertain about him. As the boy led the way to the restaurant, ignoring the stares and comments along the way, he nattered on about some team who had been throwing snowballs during the chunin exams in Kiri a year and a half ago. Temari, Kankuro, and Baki found this story very amusing for some strange reason. He didn't find it all that entertaining, however. Finally, after following the boy through several winding streets, the group arrived at a stand called Ichirako that apparently sold ramen. While ramen wasn't his favorite food, it wasn't his least favorite food either. It wasn't all that common in Suna actually, and he'd only had it maybe once or twice before, so he hadn't formed much of an opinion of it. Kankuro and Temari didn't seem all that happy about the boy's choice, but they didn't seem too dismayed either. Baki just shrugged, smiled, and took a seat next to the one the boy was moving towards. Apparently, no insult had been intended by the boy's selection of eatery. Hey! Tochi-san! I brought you some more customers. The blonde boy called out to the stand's proprietor as soon as he was seated. Unlike the treatment the boy received from the village's other civilians, the greeting Naruto received from the proprietor of the stand was cheerful and enthusiastic. He could see why this place would be the boy's favorite restaurant. Even if the food wasn't the best, the atmosphere alone was relatively pleasant. Baki watched the boy that intelligence had indicated was the jinchuriki of the Kyubi no Kitsune interact with Gaara. The difference between the two boys was like night and day. Where Gaara was cold and withdrawn, Naruto was open and rather friendly, and he could tell that it mostly wasn't an act to put him and his students off their guard. Based on the behavior of the civilian population, it had not been their actions towards the boy that had made the difference between him and Gaara which made him wonder all the more what had. As he watched the boy converse with his students and eat, he ate a meal of his own. While ramen wasn't his favorite food, it was acceptable. The name of the stand's owner was fitting for a ninja village, as it could mean both to make noodles by hand and to kill with one's bare hands. Based on the looks he was receiving from the man was fully willing to try to live up to the second meaning of his name if he made any untoward moves towards Konoha's jinchuriki. Perhaps that was the difference between the two boys. The few people who actually cared for the Kyuubi's jinchuriki had gotten to him in time. Chapter 17, Chunin Exams, Mizukage Marriage. Zabuza still couldn't figure out how Mei had managed to throw together a traditional wedding so fast. The wedding had happened a week after Mei had made her ultimatum, rather than after the months it usually took to properly plan and arrange such an undertaking, and the only way he could think of how that could have happened was that she had everything ready and waiting for when she finally netted a husband and only had to schedule the time of the wedding. All he really knew was that it had happened so fast that it had made his head spin. Practically 1 minute he was a relatively free man, and the next, he had a Mrs. Momochi hanging off his arm. At this moment, he could consider himself to be rather fortunate. He was alive and he had a beautiful wife, and things could have been worse, a lot worse. Still, being married to the Mizukage had not been one of his stated goals in life. Admittedly, the first 4 were male, but still. As they negotiated the crowd of well-wishers and ass-kissers that had shown up to congratulate the new couple, Mei latched onto his arm as if she was almost afraid that he'd try to escape. Haku hovered nearby, ready to provide protection if it were needed. Considering the fact that Mei had 2 Kekii Genkai, it probably wouldn't be. "How many kids do you plan on having?" some guy in the crowd asked as they passed by. Kids? Oh God. He could see it now. Even if they inherited only one of Mei's Kekii Genkai, it would be bad enough when they start discovering their powers. A kid with dark reddish-brown hair and brown eyes argues with his or her black-haired, green-eyed older sibling. All of a sudden, the Mizukage residence where he was stuck living as a house husband starts filling up with lava. Thank the gods that Haku would be there to sort things out. The evening before the Chunin exams were to start, Kankuro made his way to the barbecue restaurant that blonde ninja had pointed out on the way back to Suna's quarters on his first day here. Tomorrow was the first day of the Chunin exams, and he figured that it would be well worth the expense to have a good dinner before they happened in case he didn't survive what was coming next. On his way to the restaurant, he saw a reasonably attractive civilian woman following a masked, one-eyed shinobi, who seemed to be doing his level best to ignore her. The civilians in Suna had learned not to try something like that long ago, because if a shinobi didn't want attention, they didn't want attention, and clinging to them would more than likely result in severe injuries on the civilian's part. "Don't see how you can stand putting up with him," the woman said to the shinobi, who looked like he dearly wanted to shake the woman off, but didn't quite dare to do so for some reason. "And now, he's hanging around with foreigners. I wouldn't be surprised if his father was from IWA." It was at that point that the shinobi finally decided to react. If he hadn't been a shinobi himself, he probably wouldn't have noticed it, and would have thought it an accident like most of the other passers-by had. Most of the streets in Konoha were simply hard-packed dirt as they had been since the founding of the village. While there wasn't too much dust due to certain dust control methods which had been put in place, including D-ranked missions assigned during the driest part of the year, there was the occasional mud puddle here or there either after it rained, or there was a spill of some sort. In a lightning-fast move, the shinobi tripped the woman, knocked her into a particularly large and somewhat scummy-looking puddle that the other pedestrians had been avoiding, and continued on his way as if nothing had happened, having apparently reached the end of his rope and decided that doing so was worth the potential consequences should he be caught. As he continued on his way to the restaurant, chuckling over the stupidity of the woman who had apparently insulted a friend of the shinobi, several people moved to help the woman who was shrieking as if someone had just tried to murder her. The place he was going to was owned by one of the local ninja clans, and it was totally awesome. He'd been there once before, and he could completely understand how the Akimichi got so fat. Tamari sighed as she walked through the park that had supposedly been built shortly after the founding of the village in a joint effort between the Shodai Hokage and the head of the Uchiha clan, which had been pointed out to her by the blonde Konoha genin on the way to register for the exams which would be starting the next day. There were trees and flowers everywhere she cared to look as she wandered the main path. Both were a rather rare sight back in Suna, since only the hardiest of plants grew in the deep desert where her home was located. Briefly pausing in her tracks, she bent over to smell one of the roses that grew on the well-tended bushes that lined the cobblestone path. It was a real pity that this would all be gone soon. Both her village and Otogakure would be razing the village to the ground in a little over a month if things went according to plan. A park like this, no matter how nice, would not survive the coming battle. Gaara felt slightly apprehensive about going to the ramen stand while the boy named Naruto wasn't there. While the man who ran the stall treated him like just another customer while his best customer was there, he wasn't entirely certain that he would be treated the same if he weren't, and he wasn't too sure how he would react if he were treated differently. The man who had run the ramen stand had been one of the few people in his life to actually be nice to him, and expect little to nothing in return. When he reached Ichiraka Ramen, he took an available seat next to a black-haired shinobi and waited. The owner noticed him after a few seconds. "Welcome, welcome," the man said warmly, giving him a genuine smile as he did so. Despite the fact that Naruto wasn't here to protect him or whatever, the man wasn't trembling, and there wasn't any fear in his eyes. The man actually seemed to appreciate his presence. Relieved that this was so, he made his order, which the man promptly began to prepare. That settled it. When the time for the invasion came, he was going to have this man kidnapped and brought to Suna. Preparing for the upcoming chunin exams, which Kakashi had only just informed him that he'd signed the team up for that afternoon, Naruto carefully inspected his equipment, discarding anything that was irreparable. He would buy replacements for everything he discarded at the local supply store once he was done. If the exams followed the same format they had in Kiri, there would be a test of information gathering skills followed by a test of team survival skills. He and his equipment would both need to be in top form during the second portion of the exams. Fortunately here, things would go differently since he held the home ground advantage. He knew the forests surrounding the village like the back of his hand from all of the time he spent playing in them. He knew just about every rock, tree, and hunting trap for miles around in any direction. He would be able to tell if anything was off long before he reached any traps or ambushes, and react accordingly. This time, he would pass. This time, nobody on his team would be injured. This time, none of his comrades would die. Once he finished examining and sorting his supplies, he started sharpening his shuriken and kunai. Sakura went to inform Suzume that they wouldn't be meeting the next day, because she had been entered into the chunin exams. She had almost forgotten to do so in her excitement, and it was only when she had been mentally going over her taijutsu skills that she'd realized that she had a training session scheduled with Suzume tomorrow. This was 6 months earlier than she had expected to be entered, but she would be ready, she had to be. 3 months ago, she would have been uncertain about this, and spent the entire night worrying over whether she should take the exams or not, and she would have decided to take them in the end because Sasuke would be taking them, and she didn't want Sasuke to leave her behind. Now, she was going to take the exams, because they were the next step towards her future goal, and she would pass on her own merits, and for her own reasons. While she didn't want Sasuke to leave her behind, that wouldn't be the only reason she would be taking the exams. The chunin exams were the first major step on the road to her future, and she would need to pass them to find where that road would lead. As he got some last-minute training in, Sasuke pummeled the training post in front of him with his fists, imagining that it was that man. He would be taking the chunin exams tomorrow, and he needed to be in top form. Kakashi had sprung their entry into the chunin exams on them as a surprise only that afternoon when he'd turned them loose from the day's training. If he'd informed them, say, whenever it was that he'd entered them, he would have had more time to train and prepare. As it was, he was stuck getting in a great deal of last-minute training, and hoping that he wouldn't be too exhausted tomorrow morning when they went to take the first test. That boy had told him to expect something along the lines of an information-gathering exercise, which would be followed by a survival test of some sort that included combat. In order to prepare for the coming ordeal, he would train for a few more hours, and then he would gather any equipment he thought necessary for the exams. As the moon rose higher in the sky, causing the barred windows to cast bands of shadow, Satoshi lay back on the bunk in his cell. The last 6 days had been boring as hell. He would be getting out tomorrow, but not in time for the exams, so he wouldn't be playing gin and plant as he had been assigned to be before he'd gotten arrested. He wondered if Naruto was entered into this one, as he hadn't said a word about it when he dropped by to visit. He was pretty sure that he would have said something before now if he were entered, but then again, Naruto hadn't visited him since his first day here, because he wanted him to learn his lesson. He honestly couldn't believe that he'd got caught stealing from a measly genin. Just for that, he was going to rob Bunraku Boy and his teammates blind before they went home. Tetsuo smiled as he played with his daughter, who was crawling around and making a mess out of a pile of blocks. Tomorrow, Naruto would be taking the chunin exams, and he wouldn't be able to be there for him, because Hatake Kakashi was his sensei on paper. He could still wish him luck and cheer him on, however, and he would be doing just that. Satoshi would be getting out of jail tomorrow afternoon as well. He sometimes wondered where he went wrong with the boy, and then he remembered that it wasn't him. His wife was a bit like Satoshi, but had sworn to quit stealing if he quit conning people. So far, they both had technically kept their word. The beloved missus for whom he'd happily sacrifice anything and everything had caught his attention when she had lifted his wallet, and he had gotten hers when he conned her out of the 25,000 ryo she had stolen from him. It had been love at first sight. He'd known it when he'd taken back merely what she'd stolen from him and nothing more. If she'd just been a job to him, he would have gotten more than that piddling sum. The Hokage held the unopened letter he'd just received from the Mizukage, almost dreading what would be inside. Considering the way his luck had been going in regards to Kirigakure lately, there was a good chance that it would be another mess that would need to be sorted out. Just what he needed when he was already busy dealing with the chunin exams. Eventually, after a great deal of deliberation, he decided to open the letter and get it over with the way one would finally rip off a band-aid. The sooner he read it, the sooner he could deal with whatever it was that needed to be dealt with. Anticipating the worst, he broke the seal and opened the scroll. Here goes nothing. Ha! All that worry over nothing. It was just a letter apologizing to him for not inviting him to the wedding between the new Mizukage and one Momochi Zabuza. Well, that was unexpected. After getting home and feeding his dogs, Kakashi ate his own meal in silence. Today had been a rather trying day, and tomorrow would be nerve-wracking. He had entered his team into the chunin exams much the way Minato-sensei had entered him, and his first team shortly after they graduated, so they could see exactly what they were up against and become determined to do better next time. It was best to set them up for failure now, so they would know what they needed in order to succeed later. Unlike him himself when he had been first sent to the exams, his team most likely wouldn't make it through, as they were barely willing to work with each other, and several larger, stronger, older, and more unified teams had been entered from Konoha alone. Right now, they were marginally better than they had been before the C rank from Hell, but it didn't seem to be enough. He would be there for them though, and he would wish them luck even though luck wouldn't be enough in this case. In the Mizukage Tower in Kiri, Haku stood guard outside the door to the Mizukage's bedroom. He was going to make sure that nobody would intrude on this most important of nights. Back in the village he'd lived near when he was little, it had been something of a tradition to make a lot of noise outside of the home of a newlywed couple on their wedding night. He had a feeling that Zabuza-sama wouldn't appreciate that though, and therefore had kept any local well-wishers away accordingly. As he began to drift off, there was a loud yell that pulled him out of his half-awake state. Before he could even think, he raced into the room from which the yell came only to find that Zabuza-sama and the new Mizukage were in a tangle of limbs and covers on the bed, and that there were no signs of intruders or a fight. Haku, Zabuza said, sounding somewhat irritated. Yes? He asked. Get out. Blushing so badly that his normally exceedingly pale face probably looked like a tomato, he complied with his master's orders. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.